Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to speak and to come back to Norway and Oslo. Hildy and I, as you're my colleague, we've been lucky enough to work with a number of companies and organisations in Norway in the last few years, and it's safe to say if we could emigrate and move pre-Brexit, we would do it, but it may not happen, and we may have to just run away to Scotland. You can get from my accent, I'm from Scotland. Nope. And the button doesn't work. Oh, it's not on. Press the on button, Ian, that helps. Okay, so who am I? I was a clinical doctor, a GP, up in Glasgow for about 15 years. But I'm also a health informatician, and that's what I've been doing for most of the rest of my life. I got into health informatics and computing very early on, almost 30 years ago. Worked on that little ZX Spectrum. That was my first effort. I am one of those clinicians who code. Now, you may remember Tamaj said clinicians should not code. Well, some of us do, so there. And I've gone away from that because I've been concentrating on this openEHR world, but I've just started teaching myself JavaScript, so there. I'm here representing primarily the Aperta Clinical Modelling Group, which I'll talk a little bit halfway through the presentation. I'm co-chair with Tamaj of the openEHR Foundation. I haven't anything to do with the invention of openEHR. I hope Tamaj and I jointly have taken that story forward, but much of the original thinking came from elsewhere. And so I'm very much that the work that I'm doing is building on other people's really great ideas. There's a number of other affiliations which may not mean much to you in Norway, but they're worth running through. Interopen is a cross-vendor community in the UK to try to build interoperability. I'm a board member there. I have this association with Code for Health, which is a branch of NHS Digital, which effectively is the technology board in England. And I have some research associate posts at University College London. I also have a couple of commercial roles. Hildy, my wife and I, we run a small consultancy, and it's in that role we've done quite a lot of work in and around Norway with a number of Norwegian companies. We also have a mad startup, which I'll mention very, very briefly, but fundamentally is about taking some of the ideas that you've heard about and saying, look, why can't we just do this in the cloud as platform or even software as a service? Because I think that's where this market will go. So, on to where we start. And the story for me in terms of the UK, I'd been working on open-air projects, including the Moscow project and the Slovenian hospital project that Tamaj mentioned. But in the UK, things were really messed up. Back in 2014, there was this, the big national program. It was just petering out. Literally, the money was running out in 2014. They'd blown 12 billion. They'd got virtually nothing from it, and they'd managed to kill the SME market in the UK. That was a good spend of money. And I'd been talking about openEHR, but not getting much traction. To be honest, everybody was still a bit shell-shocked. But out of that came there was a little bit of a revolution back then. People started to say, particularly clinicians said, we should really invest in open source and open standards. Frankly, it was very naive. It didn't really get traction. It wasn't properly funded. But we started to work on this kind of idea of the open platform. Handy was a not-for-profit. I'm very good at not-for-profits. I involve lots of not-for-profits. Even my for-profits are mostly not-for-profit. But this was a small sort of think tank, say, how can we stimulate the app market? And it came from a number of us who, like me, had been in this job for a long time, had watched the growth, particularly of the GP market, and then the whole thing stalls. And it continued to stall, even though there was this really vibrant community of people trying to build mobile apps and open source apps, and they all got stuck because it's just really, really hard. It's an incredibly difficult market to get into, commercially and technically. And what we started to recognize was that we need something that these people could build their great ideas on, because asking them to do all the heavy-duty lifting of all the data management and the audit trails and the terminology, we need a platform. We didn't call it that at that time, but we needed this kind of idea. So this was, a 2014 slide, which starts to set out those ideas. And although, obviously, Tamaj and I are passionate about openEHR, Open platforms is not just about that. We need a mix of technologies, including HL7 Fire, including SNOMED, including IHE XDS, and others. But this is fundamentally what the vision of the world that we're trying to go to. And Tamaj and others have talked about this, so I won't go through it. But fundamentally, we want to unlock the potential of people building apps without having to do all the heavy-duty stuff down here. And we now think we have a solution for doing that. I'm sure this is not the end of the story. openEHR and this kind of domain-driven, almost database-listic technology is only the start of the way people will be building health IT systems in the future. This will become the way we do things, whether it's openEHR or something else in the future. And the whole point is to separate the app development from this difficult layer of data storage, data management, the complexity of health data that Birger very, very nicely exposed. We want to take that away from people who want to build great applications, great user experiences. And that means effectively commoditizing this layer down the bottom and having it in an open and vendor-neutral manner. So, I hope you've all been able to pick up a copy of this, because my colleague Ewan Davis and I, who's my CEO in Inidis, this little commercial company, he and I have worked in the GP market for many, many years, and he's the primary author of this. Aperta is a non-profit founded by NHS Digital and NHS England, really to help promote open standards and open source in the health space in the UK. And they very kindly funded the publication of this document. I won't go through the principles, you can see them there in front of you, but I have to say this has been a really seminal document in terms of moving people's ideas. Ewan pitched it really nicely in terms of people who are making procurement decisions, people who don't particularly have detailed technical knowledge or don't want to get down into the weeds of why this technology matters. So we found it a really, really helpful document in starting to shape ideas, starting to change ideas, and I would urge you to delve into it a little bit more. So 4 years later, and a lot of conversations, and at times you think nobody's listening, things are starting to change, and you've heard of some of the real projects with real patient data that are now moving in the UK. We heard from Rachel in Salford. We've got Genomics England project. We've got NHS Plymouth, and just recently Muswell Hill, another NHS trust, using openEHR-based CDR technologies. We've got a whole new bunch of projects just coming on stream. It's what's called the LHCREs. These are kind of like community efforts to improve data sharing and commonality of applications across regions, and there's been quite a bit of money pumped into them. 2 of these have opted for openEHR solutions out of the 5. We've got some interesting stuff going on in Scotland, and we have a burgeoning clinical modelling community, and that effectively is the badge I'm wearing today in talking to you. So let's look at a couple of those projects in more detail. The genomics one is very interesting, and it is, I think, maybe significant that as we were trying to work this up, Birger came over to London to talk about this, and I think it's fair to say that Birger's ideas and our ideas have been communally shaped. So this is a big, hugely well-funded project run by Genomics England, which is a branch of the NHS. And their job fundamentally is to collect blood samples from patients who opt in. These are patients with cancer and rare diseases. So they opt in to have their DNA analysed, and Genomics England effectively handles that genomic side. They store that in their own data stores and databases. But that's only part of the project. The other part is to say, well, we need to line up those DNA samples with what they call clinical phenotypics. The signs, the symptoms, the lab tests, all the visible things of how that relates to the patient's health in the real world. And that job is effectively subcontracted to groups of hospitals around the UK who agree to work together to extract the data from local systems, local hospital systems, GP systems, collate it, put it together, tidy it up, and then they pass that on to Genomics England. And we now have had a whole bunch of genomic centres starting to look at and actually deploy openEHR-based solutions to do that effectively as local integrators using these CDRs, the clinical data repositories, as an interim staging post, partly because they saw that as a great way of normalizing the data, but also because they believe for the future they want to be able to use those pots of data for other things beyond the lifetime of this project. Right? So they're thinking ahead. And so Hilde and I were involved in building the data set using these openEHR archetypes and templates. This is an example of what we've done. And it starts to show the reuse. All right, so we're not doing this from scratch. We can make use of the archetypes and some templates that were developed internationally, some of which were developed by Celia and her colleagues here. We, of course, have to shape it for our own purposes. Health data, as Birger is saying, is really, really messy. There isn't one very simple, use one set of data universally. All of this needs to be shaped. But given that this is, by definition, a project that deals with rare kinds of data, it's rare diseases, we're still seeing a significant amount of reuse. And a number of the archetypes that we've developed locally, we'll be giving back to the international community. The premise of this world is that this kind of clinical knowledge should be shared openly and freely. That's the open source bit. Around that, there's lots of room for commerciality. This is not about everything needs to be open source. It has to be open source where it matters in terms of the critical clinical knowledge. Other projects. And what's interesting is it is splitting into kind of two ways of seeing it. You saw Andy Blofield talking about the best of breed approach in Plymouth. And that is a really interesting project. And particularly that they see this as that first of type, the e-prescribing system, is only the first application that they want to deploy. They've already deployed the second one. It's a simple little application. It's an allergies app that they deployed themselves on top of the platform. Nothing to do with Moran. They wrote the software. But it was a significant clinical missing link in terms of their portal technology. They don't have a big system. They have, as Andy described, they have this pot of not terribly well integrated little systems, and they want to build more of those. You heard Rachel talking about what they're doing in Salford, and that's almost the other end of the bimodal. They have a big Allscripts legacy system, but they don't want to give everything to Allscripts. And curiously, I'm hearing that Allscripts are quite happy with that. And I've heard this from other major, often US vendors. They're now starting to realize they can't do everything. They're actually getting in the way because big cumbersome systems, which are there to do the headline jobs, are slow to react. And so they're actually quite comfortable about the CDR sitting alongside Allscripts. It actually solves their problem. They can focus on their strengths. They don't see it as as competition. We've got others coming up. We've been speaking to a bunch of mental health trusts. NHS Wales, Northern Ireland, Wales have actually just released a tender for a small demo. The UK Military Health Service has also been toying with this. We suspect they won't go down that road. But what is interesting is we also know that the Chinese Red Army are looking at openEHR, and we're not entirely sure if it's good to share that knowledge between these two groups. It might help, but it might not. Whoops. So other examples. Rachel mentioned the person-held record, the HELM application. So this is another project that I've been working with, primarily working with a different CDR, so a different back-end vendor with an open source solution called Ethersys, but which is compatible with the Moran solution and would be compatible with DIPS and Proshensky and whatever. And that was part of that project, was to prove that we could effectively run the Ripple Helm application on top of a number of different CDRs. And we've successfully done that, and that's one of the reasons that Rachel is looking to use this as the application, a patient health record application, sitting as part of the Manchester or Salford ecosystem, but with a different vendor supplying the back-end solution. I've talked about this idea of community health integrations. And then there's this idea of open platform CDSS. There's part of the openEHR specifications guideline definition language developed by Cambio in Sweden. And NHS Scotland have adopted that. Now, it's a different space from the kind of open data platform that we're talking about. It's closer to the task management work that Tomaj mentioned earlier. But there's no doubt that it hit a sweet spot in terms of what NHS Scotland were trying to achieve. They were fed up with vendor lock-in. And when this was suggested, they wanted a national clinical decision support standard. The fact that it could be developed commercially, but if you like, the knowledge artifacts would be managed independently, like archetypes and templates, really hit the spot with them, and that is currently being worked on. On the back of that, NHS Scotland are starting to wake up to the potential of a CDR as part of their new NHS national digital platform. So there's just some interesting conversations starting there. One of the key parts of this story is obviously about these models. How do we develop these? And we don't have time. When Ildi and I are trading, we spend a day talking about how this works because it's an interesting way. But fundamentally, we've picked up on the open source way of developing things. It's about sharing. It's about collaborative development, and it's evolutionary. We expect things to go in funny directions. We expect things to go a bit wrong. That's fine. We have a branch over here, we stop working on it, we go there. It takes a rather long-term and strategic view about developing standards. It's not a very good way of developing standards, but it's a much, much better way than anything that's gone before. And you can see the vibrancy and innovation that comes out of the open source software world. It's messy, it's confusing, there's competing ideas, but through that bubble up, good quality. So we've been, in some ways, shadowing that, Norway and Silvia's team are effectively pioneering some of the ways that this is working. And we're shadowing this. We have our own copy of this CKM tool in the UK. It's kind of, headline owned by the Aperta Foundation, but it's actually a collaboration of different health providers and governments. Just to reiterate a little bit about what this archetype and template thing is about, it is about providing the data models to sit behind applications, and that effectively would be a template, so we template out for a particular app. But it's also about developing these individual components that can be reused in many, many different applications. So here we've got issue, weight, blood pressure, HbA1c, and assessment. Imagine these are different component archetypes. Birger showed you the blood pressure one in more detail. There's a lot of stuff in there. And that's being used in a diabetic checkup, but patients with diabetes also get pregnant. And you want to be able to move that data. It should be patient-centric. Behind this, there's a patient who this data all applies to. So we can use the same data definitions in a completely different template, in this case, a cardiology clinic. And of course, this is app-independent or device-independent. It's about the data. We're not trying to build apps here. We're trying to build the data sets that sit behind them. So in Norway, and it's interesting because in Norway, if you like, this gentle revolution, as I like to think about it, is largely being driven by vendors. Being driven by vendors like DIPS, like Fürst, like Pasiensky, and others who we know are working in this space. It's been a little bit different in the UK, where it is actually much more about NHS organisations and providers, healthcare providers. So we've taken a different view in terms of the really core work we've done. We're certainly publishing things like the Genomics England archetypes are being published into this space, but we're not particularly spending time on reviewing them and curating them, which is the bulk of the work that's being done in Norway and internationally. We've actually chosen to, if you like, commit to what we're calling our opinionated openEHR templates. So these are big issue, big ticket things like analogies list, a problems list, vital signs, Muse or Muse score. How do we do metabolic signs like height and weight? How do we do lab tests? Because this is 5 nations is the reality in the UK. We actually are working with 5 different nations who have 5 different health systems increasingly growing apart. And we want to say, look, we're not sure that these templates will work absolutely correctly for you in your environment because there are different countries and there are different clinical ideas sometimes. But here's our best bet about what is likely to fit. You may have to adapt it a little bit, or you may be able to pull it out of the box. One of the things that we absolutely want to do is to fit with the HL7 fire community. So there's quite a lot of work happening in the UK around that. We can't ignore it. We're not trying to compete with that. What we can do is say, look, if we build these templates, we can also build, as a community, we can build the connectors out to HL7 Fire or V2 or whatever it is that you want to join up with. Well, we can do that as a community. You don't have to do that as an individual vendor or as an individual provider. And as Mike and others said, this actually lands an enormous amount of cost and complexity to anybody coming new to this market. So this is something that our Indidus company was involved with. We actually built a set of connectors between these openEHR archetypes and templates out to HL7 Fire, open sourced and on our GitHub repository, and anybody can see them and use them. So it's a story that we have to tell. That, you know, I know there's interest in fire in Norway and as in many other European countries, and that will be the norm for many, if you like, legacy systems or people that are using older-fashioned technology. And we have to live in that world as well. But we can do actually quite easily. Because all of the data is structured and available in openEHR, it's actually quite easy for us to expose that through Fire or any other interface. Actually, I wrote some of the code. Don't tell Tomasz. It's that easy. I'll just throw in another idea that Ewan and I have been playing around with, which we think has some potential here, but would absolutely have to be underpinned by an open platform. So I've listened with some cynicism as an old GP, you know, paternalistic, don't believe that patients should have any rights at all. You know, you do what I tell you. I've listened to the person-held record story, you know, which has all been about Fitbits and lifestyle and, you know, mom-and-pop medicine. It's rubbish. It's rubbish. But actually, I'm changing my mind, because I have seen how people are starting to use what you might call the patient-held record to extend the clinical record. All right, so there's a couple of projects in the UK where they're using things like Microsoft Health Vault to store the data to allow people to innovate around the edges of what is quite a difficult governance and technical system. And that's great, but it is not, in my view, going to be trusted data. It's working at the moment because, although it's badged as a PHR, it's actually governed by the hospitals, usually. And we have to move beyond that. We have to move and that then becomes a rate-limiting issue. It means we can't have people coming in and developing new apps on top of that. It means that a patient can't go to an app store and say, I want that, I want the data to be stored, but I want that data to be stored in a format that is open and transferable to someone else, that is properly audited, medical legally safe, because I want my clinicians to trust that. I own it in terms of I am able to distribute it and I can shut down access rights. And we think there's an interesting conversation around this idea of a co-produced health record backed by an open platform data store that opens up all sorts of potential for liberating the way that data is stored and managed, much more patient-centric, but it has to be underpinned by the kind of professional responsibilities and requirements that we have. In other words, patients are actually brought in as fellow professionals and they play by the same rules in terms of data governance. Very new idea, we're just rolling it out at the moment, but we think that's definitely the future. This is not an easy story to tell. You know, myself, Tomasz, and others have been telling this story for a few years, and there's no doubt that people find it quite challenging. This isn't more of the same. This is about fundamentally rewiring health IT. It's about building systems differently. I used to say interoperability is not about IT, it's all about people. There's a lot of truth in that, but actually part of the reason that people can't share data easily is they can't expose that data easily, even in their own systems. We're trying to change that quite fundamentally through the open data platform and openEHR approach. This whole idea, the way that people interact with these systems, you never see the database. That freaks out, you know, 70% of the existing developer market, who the first thing they'll do is design their database. We're saying, you don't have a database, you don't see a database, you just work with the data. Some people love it. Other people go, what do you mean? Show me the tables. Nah, you don't need to, you don't get to, it's not necessary. There's no doubt that as we're starting to get some traction, we're starting to see a bit of fear, uncertainty, doubt. There are certain companies, sectors, who are quite challenged by this. You know, when we were little and it was just an idea, they just kind of laughed, you know. Now that we're starting to get some traction, we're starting to really step on commercial toes. And it's quite interesting to hear the little bits of gossip and feedback coming back, like openEHR must die, quote. And I can't tell you who it was, but it's really interesting gossip. So we're doing something quite profound, but I think we can, as Tomasz explained, with the whole bimodal approach, we can do it gently. It's not a big bang. We can introduce this bimodal joint way of working without disturbing these existing systems, and actually without disturbing what I think needs to be a commercially driven market. We're not trying to drive commerciality, we're not trying to drive business away. This is not about, free software. I think we need that in this world, but it's applying the benefits of commerciality in the right place so that we cut costs overall. So, just to finish up, I was trying to think about this whole rewiring paradigm, and I thought I'll find some interesting examples from the world of electricity. And I came across this great website called Atlas Obscura. Why can't the world, this is a question, why can't the world just pick one design for plugs? And I actually found it fascinating. For the first 20 years, there was no such thing as an electric plug. Your wiring was literally hardwired by the electric company, so you couldn't change your light fittings. If you wanted to move your light from there to there, you had to take the wall down and move the lighting. I hadn't appreciated that. And then in 1904, 20 years after electricity started being installed in people's homes, this guy, Hubble, don't think it's anything to do with the telescope, invented the first electric plug, which liberated electrical appliances from the actual infrastructure. And I guess you can see where I'm going here. There is a journey in many industries where things are locked down for perfectly good technical reasons at the time, and then innovations let us unlock that. The last bit here is that the majority of European countries use the Chuco format, developed in Germany. Now it's the Europlug standard used for many devices, ensures that travellers aren't totally screwed if trying to travel between countries. Apart from us Brits, we've still got our ancient Brexit plug, as I call it. But now, the future. Apparently, something like 80% of the world is now built around USB, which interestingly is direct current. If you know the history of electricity invention, there was a big battle between should this be AC or DC. AC won, but DC is back in the shape of USB. But is it our savior? I've just changed to a MacBook Pro, which has this wonderful invention of USB-C, so I had to spend about another 200 quid buying adapters. And the good news is that the USB community are already working on USB Type D. And this is their plans. I'll just read out to finish. Now with USB Type D, no matter how crazy your night has been, we guarantee that you'll be successfully plugging your phone before passing out. And I think that's what technology is for. That was published on April the 1st, 2015. I guess this will be coming to a market near you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian, for a very good and funny also presentation. We have one question on Slido, and it is how large a proportion of the patients would you make a problem list for? So I guess this is more for implementing this than on the modeling side. But also how important is that to have a problem list? And I think the background for this is probably that problem list isn't a thing that we're used to using in Norway. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Oh, lots. Pages. In fact, I'll just keep it brief. So this is something that I encountered in my career very early on. The hospital that I trained in was pioneering problem-oriented medical records. At the time, I wasn't the slightest bit interested in this world. But I've lived with that. And when I was a GP, we found having a list of problems, it's not just diagnosis, this could be just issues, patient gets headaches frequently, has an unhappy marriage, whatever. Having that list of problems, you can get a snapshot of what's wrong with the patient, immensely helpful. And we know it's also used in many hospitals, perhaps not in Norway, it's not so common. It is challenging because it's one of those bits of data which probably there is no one problem list. The GP will have their problem list. The patient might have their own problem list. If you're a renal physician, you're going to have a problem list because it's a working tool. It's about what do I need to do in my environment. So there's all sorts of discussions about how best to maintain these things. And it's quite an interesting area. But The headline question, is it worth having? I think absolutely, even if it can be a bit of a pain to maintain. Its value in terms of your quality of care comes back.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience directly? Okay. Thank you very much, Ian.